Montana Territory, July 1884. The river ran fast this time of year, cold as snowmelt and just as unforgiving. But that did not stop her from dropping to her knees in the shallows, boots sinking into the mud, hands shaking as she pressed them to her face. Tessa Ellery had not cried in months. Not when she buried her husband in a shallow grave by a cottonwood 3 counties south. Not when she watched her 2 children sleep on an empty stomach. Not even when the last horse was sold off for flour and a half sack of beans. But today broke her. Behind her, hooves slowed in the gravel and water. She did not turn. She could not. She knew who it was by the sound of the saddle leather and the way he sat quiet in the saddle, like the ground itself asked permission to hold him. "That them?" he asked softly. Tessa looked up, eyes red, nose raw, and swept her hand toward the 2 small graves beneath a birch tree up the bank. 2 wooden crosses leaned together, names carved in with the tip of a kitchen knife: Thomas and Tilly, 5 and 7. She let out a breath that caught halfway up her throat and shook her head. "They were sick. Fever got them fast. I tried everything." The man dismounted slowly. His boots sunk into the riverbed as he stepped toward her, not saying a word until he was close enough to kneel beside her. "I know you did," he said. "You always did everything." She turned to him then. His face was all wind and sun, creased at the corners, beard rough, hair the color of dusted bark. Beckett Vale had not changed much since she first knew him. He had just gotten quieter. "You should not have come," she whispered. "I heard." He looked at the graves. From a freighter passing through, said a woman with red hair buried 2 children by the river near Ash Hollow. "I knew it was you." Her voice broke. "I do not want you to see me like this. I already have." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded bit of cloth. "And I brought bread. It is not much, but it is warm." She stared at the bundle but did not take it. He set it on the ground beside her and waited. The river rushed on, the wind stirred the leaves, and the 2 of them sat in the silence that had always made them more comfortable than words ever did. Finally, she said, "I do not have a home anymore. I know. I do not have anything. You have me." Her eyes snapped to his, sharp and wet. "You do not owe me that." "I do not owe you anything," he said, voice steady. "But I still mean it." She shook her head and stood, wrapping her arms around herself. Her dress clung to her calves, soaked at the hem. "I do not know how to live past this." Beckett stood too, towering beside her but not crowding her. "You do not have to know. You just have to keep breathing until it hurts a little less, and I can help with that part." She turned away, shoulders trembling. "You cannot fix this." He stepped close then, not touching her yet, just standing behind her like a wall that would not fall. "I am not here to fix anything. I am here to stay." She let out a sound, half sob, half breath, and covered her mouth again. For a long time he waited. Then, when her knees buckled again, he caught her before she hit the ground. He sank with her to the riverbank, holding her close as she buried her face in his chest and finally let it all out. "I ain't leaving you here," he said into her hair, his voice breaking for the first time. "Or ever." Tessa's fingers curled into his shirt. Warmth spread through her chest like a fire finally catching. They stayed there until the sun dipped low, and the shadows stretched long, and somewhere between the grief and the river, her heart began to beat again. Not for the past, but for what might still be left ahead. The sun had dipped below the ridgeline by the time they left the river, shadows growing long along the trail. Beckett led the way up the slope with his horse in tow, and Tessa followed, arms wrapped around herself, steps careful. Her dress was still damp, streaked with creek mud. She said nothing, and he didn't press her. They came to a clearing tucked between 2 hills where the grass grew in thick tufts, and the rocks were flat enough to sit on. Beckett unsaddled his gelding and hobbled him near a black pine, then went about building a fire. Tessa watched him gather kindling with the quiet of someone who'd once known how to do these things, but hadn't had reason in a long while. When the fire caught, she knelt beside it and held her hands near the flame. Her fingers were scraped and dirt-lined, nails chipped to the quick. "You eaten anything today?" he asked. She shook her head. Beckett unwrapped the cloth he'd brought and handed her a thick slice of bread. She took it without meeting his eyes. He settled across from her, back against a boulder, and pulled off his hat. "You got anyone left?" "No." Her voice was flat. "Mama died the winter after Tilly was born. My brother took a claim up near Fort Benton but ran off with some trapper's daughter. No word since. Your husband's people, he was an only child. Parents were gone before we met." Beckett nodded slowly and picked up a stick, twirling it between his fingers. "You thinking of heading somewhere? Town, maybe?" "I don't belong in a town." She paused, chewing slowly. "I thought about Billings. They say there's work up there if you don't mind washing for railroad men. You'd hate it there." "I'd endure it." He looked at her then, long and steady. "There's another way." She didn't answer, just kept eating, eyes fixed on the fire. "I've got a cabin up near the Musselshell, just 2 rooms, but the roof holds and there's a root cellar. I've kept it up." She blinked. "You're still out that way, never left. But you used to talk about going to Idaho." "I did. Then I stayed." She stared into the flames like they might answer for him. "Why?" Beckett tossed the stick into the fire. "Because I was waiting on a reason." Tessa's breath caught, but she didn't let it show. "You can't mean me." "I always meant you." She stood abruptly, brushing crumbs from her skirt, and paced a few steps toward the trees. The wind moved through the pines with a low hush. "You have no idea what you're offering," she said, voice tight. "I do. You're talking about taking in a broken woman with nothing but grief and a half-rotted satchel." "I know what I'm saying." She turned back to him. "I couldn't give you children." His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed quiet. "That's not why I came." Tessa looked away, arms wrapped tight around her ribs. "I can't promise I'll ever be whole. I'm not asking for whole. I'm asking for real." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of pine branches in the fire. Then she walked back and sat beside him, closer than before, knees almost touching. "You always were too steady for your own good," she murmured. He gave a low chuckle. "And you always were too proud to ask for help." "I still am." Beckett reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn at the corners. He handed it to her. She unfolded it slowly. A hand-drawn map, lines traced in pencil, marked with a small square beside the river bend. "That's home," he said. She didn't speak, just held the paper in her lap and stared at it until her shoulders eased and her eyes softened. "Will you take me there?" she asked. "I already was," he said. Tessa folded the map and slipped it into her pocket. Then, for the first time since the river, she leaned her weight against him. Beckett didn't move. He just let her be there, warm and real beside him, and the night settled quiet around them like the start of something long and good. By the time the sky turned the soft, washed blue of early morning, they were already riding north, the wind dry against their faces, the horses steady beneath them. Tessa sat behind Beckett on his gelding, her arms loosely around his middle, her body swaying with the rhythm of his. No words had passed between them since they doused the fire and left the clearing, but the silence didn't press, it held. They stopped near midday beside a granite outcrop where wild sage grew thick, and the air carried the faint scent of chamomile. Beckett dismounted first, then helped her down with a hand at her waist, his touch brief but sure. She looked around, taking in the open stretch of land, the way the hills folded into each other like old quilts laid across the earth. "This is near where the Crow used to travel through," she said, brushing dust from her skirt. "My father once traded with them. He said they knew every bend of this ground." They still do, Beckett said, tying the reins to a low branch. I've seen their smoke trails on the ridges further west. She crouched to stretch her legs, her knees aching from the ride. You ever trade with them? I hunted with a man from the Apsaluk band one winter, he said, sitting on a flat stone. He taught me how to find fox dens when the snows crusted over. She glanced up. Did you speak their language? Enough to keep from offending anyone. He poured water from his canteen into a tin cup and handed it to her. You pick up a lot just listening. Tessa drank slowly, the water warm but welcome. You always did listen more than you talked, Beckett shrugged. Words don't fix much. She handed the cup back. No, but they anchor things sometimes. They stayed there, the wind pulling gently at her braid, a hawk circling high above. She watched Beckett as he dug into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded scrap of linen. Inside were dried apples and a small wedge of white cheese. She blinked. Where'd you get that? Traded a skin for it 2 days back at a camp near the Judith. He broke the cheese in half and offered her a piece. Figured you'd want something that hadn't been boiled to death. She took it and chewed slowly, the salt sharp on her tongue. I used to make cheese like this, only mine was softer. You still have the press? No, she said. Left it behind when we had to move, couldn't carry everything. He nodded and leaned back against the rock. We could make another. She glanced at him. You mean once we get to your place? I mean once we're settled. Tessa folded her hands in her lap. You keep saying things like that, like it's already decided. It is. She looked away, lips pressed into a line. I don't know what I'll be to you. He turned his head toward her, his voice low. You'll be whatever you choose to be, but I'll treat you like you matter, same as always. I don't know if I'm any good at being wanted. You don't have to be good at it. You just have to let it happen. Her breath caught, but she didn't look at him. Instead, she stared at the horizon where the grass met sky and the land rolled on, wide and waiting. I used to dream about going to California, she said after a long pause. When I was young. Thought the ocean sounded like something that could swallow sorrow. Beckett picked up a pebble and rolled it between his fingers. You still want to go? She shook her head. No, I think I just wanted somewhere to feel like mine. He tossed the pebble into the grass. That's what I've been building, a place that's mine. Doesn't mean it has to stay just mine. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt again. Then she turned to him, her voice steadier than before. I won't be easy. I don't want easy. She stared at him, then nodded once, slow. All right. They rode on through the afternoon, the horses finding their rhythm again. The trail narrowed as they moved into thicker timber, alder and pine giving shape to the hills. Tessa's hands rested more firmly at his waist now, her body no longer holding back. They spoke little as the light shifted, but there was nothing strained in it. When the shadows stretched long again and the wind turned cooler, Beckett motioned toward a dip in the land where cottonwoods grew, their leaves flickering silver. Just beyond there, he said. Another day's ride and we'll be home. She didn't ask what it looked like or how big the rooms were or whether it had curtains. She only said, then let's keep going. And he did. The wind shifted near dusk, bringing with it the scent of wood smoke and something faintly sweet, maybe wild chokecherry blooming in the slant of late summer. Tessa caught it first and lifted her head from where it had rested lightly against Beckett's back. There's someone burning pine, she said. He slowed the horse with a soft word, listening. Northwest, maybe half a mile, he murmured. Likely a hunter's camp. They didn't veer toward it, just kept to the narrow trail winding through dense fir and aspen until the trees fell away and the land opened into a wide basin, ringed by hills. A creek split the valley floor, its waters catching the last light like a blade laid flat. And there, tucked near a stand of larch, sat the cabin. Tessa drew breath but said nothing. The structure was modest, single-chimneyed, its logs silvered from seasons of wind, the porch low and even. Smoke curled from the flue. A dog, lean and brindled, lifted its head from where it lay beside the steps and gave one sharp bark before bounding down the slope. Beckett dismounted first. "That's just Alder. He don't bite unless you're a fox or foolish." The gelding stood calm as Beckett reached up to help her down. This time her hands found his shoulders on their own, steady and sure. When her boots hit the earth, she paused, eyes fixed on the cabin. "Someone's been here," she said. "I rode out last week, left a neighbor's boy to keep the stove going. He's gone now." She didn't ask who the boy was or why Beckett had bothered. Instead, she walked forward, slow but without hesitation. Alder trotted beside her, tail ticking the air. Inside, the air was warm and faintly smoky. A kettle hung over the hearth, its iron belly hissing. The table held 2 pewter plates, a knife laid across one. A woven rug, faded but intact, covered the packed earth floor. She turned slowly, taking in the narrow cot pushed against the far wall, the shelves lined with jars, a battered trunk with a folded quilt on top. There was no clutter, but the space didn't feel empty. "You live like a man who expects company," she said. "I hoped for it," he answered. She stepped toward the trunk and ran her fingers over the quilt. "You made this?" "No, my sister before she passed. I kept it because her hands touched it." Tessa looked over her shoulder. "You never told me you had a sister." "She died before I met you. Fever took her the year after I came west." She nodded once, then turned back to the quilt. "It's good work. I was thinking you'd take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire. I'm not asking you to do that." "I know." She walked to the window, the glass wavy with age. Outside, the light had cooled to blue. She tapped her fingers against the sill. "I don't remember the last time I stood inside a place that didn't feel borrowed." Beckett stepped beside her but didn't speak. She nodded to the creek. "That water run all year, even in freeze. There's trout if you're patient." "I'm not." "I am." She laughed, the sound brief and surprised, then quieted. "What do people call this place?" No name really stuck. "Some just say the Bend." Her voice dropped. "Then it's ours to name." Beckett turned toward her, his eyes steady. "You want to stay? I wouldn't have come this far if I didn't." He reached for her hand then, not quick but certain. His palm was warm and calloused, fingers rough at the joints. She didn't pull away. "I don't expect anything from you," he said. "Not now, not ever." Tessa looked down at their hands. "I know what grief makes you do, and I know what it takes to keep walking after it. You don't have to carry it alone." "I won't," she said. "Not anymore." She lifted her eyes to his, and something passed between them, quiet, sure, and full of the kind of knowing that doesn't need to be spoken. Outside, the last of the light faded from the hills. Inside, the fire crackled low and steady, and 2 people stood close, not out of need but out of choice. And for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt alone. The first frost arrived before the month turned, dusting the basin grass in white lace by dawn. Tessa woke early, pulled on Beckett's spare wool shirt over her chemise, and stepped out onto the porch. The morning held a stillness so complete it hushed even her thoughts. Inside, Beckett stirred the fire before she returned. He didn't look up when she came in, only handed her a thick pair of socks he'd cut and stitched from an old coat. "They're rough," he said, "but they'll hold." She sat at the table and pulled them on without comment. Her fingers had stopped trembling a week ago, and her face no longer carried that hollow tightness around the eyes. She still didn't smile often, but when she did, it stayed longer. They shared breakfast in quiet cornmeal cakes with dried berries, and a strip of last season's venison Beckett had smoked in late spring. When she finished her plate, she pushed it back and looked at him across the table. "You think the soil here will take root vegetables?" He wiped his hands on a cloth. "We'll have to work the stones out, but the sun's strong and the drainage is good. I've seen potatoes come up fine in worse places." She nodded. "I'd like to try beets. And maybe carrots if I can keep the ground squirrels out. I've got traps. We'll set them near the fence line." Tessa leaned back, eyes scanning the shelves behind him. "There's a lot we could put by if we start now." Even with the season turning. Beckett reached into the crate by the hearth and pulled out a ledger. He passed it to her. "I've kept notes. What's grown, what's failed. You'll see the south patch holds warmth longer." She opened it slowly, touched by the careful pencil lines and unassuming handwriting. "You kept records. I had a feeling someone might want them someday." She looked up then, and her gaze lingered. "You always plan that far ahead." "Only for the things I don't want to lose." Neither spoke after that for a time. When the sun cleared the eastern ridge, they stepped outside together, walking the edge of the property. Beckett showed her the places where the fence leaned from snow weight and where the creek overflowed in spring. He pointed out the stand of currants growing wild near the eastern slope and the hollow under the bluff where dry wood stayed stacked through winter. "What else do you need to feel at home here?" he asked as they crossed the meadow. She thought for a while before answering. "I'd like a place to work with my hands. You've got the land, but no corner to call mine yet." "There's an old lean-to by the shed," he said. "We could rebuild it. Make it into a room for whatever you want." She stopped walking. "Why are you giving me all this?" He turned toward her. "Because I want a life with you, not just a roof." Tessa stepped close, her voice low. "You never asked what I wanted in a man. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. I wanted someone who didn't make promises they couldn't keep, someone who didn't try to outshine the grief but stood beside it." Beckett's voice roughened. "I'm not much for talk." "You don't need to be," she said and placed a hand over his heart. "You're here." He reached up, fingers brushing hers gently. "And I'm staying." That night they laid a second pallet beside the hearth. She didn't ask him to lie beside her, but he did. Not because it was owed, but because she wanted it. When she turned toward him in the dark, he drew her near and they shared their first kiss, quiet, slow, and without hesitation. The wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of pine through the shutter cracks. Inside, two people lay beneath a quilt stitched with hands now gone, but remembered. And between them there was nothing missing. They married in the spring. No preacher, no paper. Just a binding made of hands and intention beneath a sky the color of wet cotton. Tessa wore her hair in a braid, tied with a strip of blue calico. Beckett shaved close and wore the same shirt he'd worn the day she arrived. They planted early beets, onions, potatoes, and traded for a pair of hens from a neighbor 4 miles east. Tessa built shelves in the lean-to, turned it into a place for drying herbs and storing preserves. Beckett added a second window to the cabin, so she could see the meadow from the table. By midsummer, their days fell into rhythm. Mornings began with coffee and shared silence, afternoons with work, and evenings with the dogs curled by the door and the sound of her laughter coming easier now. She never spoke about California again. One evening in late July, as the sun burned low over the ridge, Tessa stood with her hands in the soil, pulling a handful of carrots free. Beckett approached with a bundle of firewood and she turned to him, cheeks flushed, hands dirty. "I forgot how good it feels to make something grow." He set the wood down and brushed a speck of dirt from her cheek. "You've been doing that since you got here." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He took her hand. "You made room in me. Made something bloom I didn't know was still alive." She leaned in, resting her forehead against his. "I didn't know either." They stood there, wrapped in the quiet gold of the hour, the land around them full and green, the creek running steady behind them. And when he kissed her again, slow and sure, she kissed him back with everything she had left to give. They built a life that held. One rooted in steadiness, shaped by hands that had known loss but chose love anyway, and it held for all the years that followed.